this discussion in an ongoing way. So housing access and affordability is among one of the most difficult challenges facing cities. Problems of affordability are as likely to attract stable, wealthier cities as they are in those in rapidly urbanizing countries. A wicked sort of challenge in and of itself, housing access and affordability are exacerbated by several of the other crises which are facing cities. The economic fallout of COVID, for example, has had a disproportionate effect on low-income households, even more of whom are now facing eviction. And many informal settlements are located on environmentally precarious areas that are especially vulnerable to flooding and landslides and other effects of climate change. This session will compare the issues of housing access and affordability as they play out in cities in Canada, Africa, China, and Latin America. The conclusions drawn and the strategies formulated will depend on the context and how the issues are framed. In other words, whether housing is seen primarily as a need, as a right, or as a means of wealth creation and social mobility. It will depend on whether housing is treated as a noun or as a verb. So my name is Benjamin Gianni. I'm associate professor and former director of the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Carleton is one of the 3 Canadian universities, so along with McGill and the University of Ottawa, that have been working with UN Habitat to bring you this conference. And my co-moderator for this session is my friend and colleague, Allan Cain. Allan is the director of the development workshop in Luanda, Angola, and he is Canada's honorary consul or default ambassador to Angola. Allan and I have had the privilege of, both of us have had the privilege of serving as vice presidents for ICCCASU. So Allan and I are very pleased today to be joined by 4 speakers in 4 very different regions. Patricia Rosset-Zupa from Canada, Lieu from China, Anna Claudia Rosbach, who's based in Brazil, and Kessia Rust from South Africa. We're extremely grateful that they've made the time to be here with us today, or this evening, as is the case in Beijing. So we've asked each of our speakers to start by giving a bit of the lay of the land. In other words, to describe how housing supply and affordability have been addressed in their country or region over the past several decades, and how that relates to particular governmental policies, economic and cultural contexts. Secondly, we've asked them to identify key challenges and issues that their country or region are facing today. And finally, we've asked them to describe 1 or 2 current innovative approaches that they think might be of interest to other regions by way of sharing best practices. So each of our guests will speak for about 15 minutes, and that should leave us about 30 minutes for discussion. There are several options for participating in the discussion. You can post questions in the chat room, or you can use the Q&A option, or as a last resort, raise your hand. All those 3 options are available to you at the bottom of your screen. So to get things going, I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Patricia Rosset-Zupa. Patricia is Vice President of Policy at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. She joined CMHC in 2009 and has held various positions in strategic policy coordination, housing finance policy, and federal, provincial, territorial relations. Patricia played a lead role in the development of Canada's first ever national housing strategy that's aimed to build inclusive communities with housing that meets the needs of Canadians and housing that they can afford. Prior to joining CMHC, Patricia worked in residential real estate, affordable housing policy, and applied urban research in Canada and in the United States. She holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from the University of Florida, an MBA from the Schulich School of Business at York University, and a Master's of Geography from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where she was born and raised. Patricia has a passion for urban design and a love for exploring cities and cultures around the world. So join me in welcoming Patricia.
Thank you so much for that very nice introduction. And it's really my pleasure to be here today and present to this audience and be part of this conference. So I am joining you today from Ottawa in the capital city of Canada. And I'm joining you from the land on which I gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg people. And so these are the Algonquin people that have lived on this land since time immemorial. And so it's very very grateful to be joining you today and to be joining you here from Ottawa. I think I'm going to have some help to present my my presentation. If Michelle is able to put that up, I'm just going to check in to see if she's able to do that, or if I should present it myself.
Michelle?
Yes, so I didn't get it yet, so could you play it yourself
Okay.
for now?
Okay. There's
Awesome.
some images in there, so perhaps that's the reason for it not having quite arrived there yet. So let me pull it up.
Okay, that sounds great.
I will do that right now. So let me do that. I'm going to share my screen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. We're seeing it, and the format in which you're showing it is just fine. So so let's just go with that.
It's all right. Okay.
Yeah.
So I will go with that. Great. So a very extremely timely topic, of course, access to housing and affordability. Something that at Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation we have been very much focused on. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, for those of you not as familiar with CMHC, is Canada's national housing agency, and CMHC was established back in 1946, right after the Second World War, initially to ensure that there is housing available for returning veterans. So CMHC has been in the business of housing in this country for a very long time. So we're Canada's national housing agency. It's a Crown corporation. We are responsible to our Canadian Parliament through a minister, and it's currently the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. We have a fairly broad mandate when it relates to housing. So we are here to contribute to housing affordability for Canadians, to ensure there is a stable housing finance system. We're here to support Canadians in housing needs. And we also are the ones that provide policy advice to our government and conduct housing research, make housing market insights available, make data available so that we can base our policy advice on all of the evidence that's out there, but also that we can put research and insights data out there to the public so that others can make their decisions to support housing in their communities. We have a corporate aspiration that is quite ambitious that we set a few years back, which is that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. So all activities within CMHC are right now very much focused on that corporate commitment and corporate aspiration that's very much driving what we do, but it's also really driving the very passionate people that we have working at CMHC. We're also the lead on Canada's national housing strategy, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to set the context around housing first before I talk about the national housing strategy. So when I turn to housing and housing need in Canada, I wanted to just set the context, especially here with a more international audience. So Canada right now has a population of about 38 million. When we look at the number of households, and I'm quoting 2016 numbers because that is the last time the census was done and the numbers that we have available. So we'll shortly have updated numbers available. But there were about 14 million households. When we look at home ownership versus renters, about almost 68% of Canadian households are homeowners, and about 32% are renters. We have a measure in place in Canada that measures what we call core housing needs, and it's in place. It's been in place for a couple of decades now, and it really measures exactly what it says: the core housing needs of Canadians. So, according to the last measure, we had 1.7 million households that were in core housing needs. So it means that they live in housing that's unaffordable, that's inadequate, that's not suitable for them. It means that they are paying at least more than 30% of the income on their rent or their housing costs. It also means that they may be living in housing situations and where the condition of the house is really not adequate, or where it might not be suitable to the size of the households. And another part of this measure really is that they don't have another choice within their community to find other affordable, suitable, and adequate housing. So there's no other housing options for that particular household. So those measures combined is what we use to measure core housing needs. It equates to just over 12% of core housing needs among population. We also look at severe core housing needs. So those households that actually pay more than 50% of their income for housing. And there's, according to the last counts, about 700,000 households that way. So that's quite significant. We would expect that number would have gone up through COVID. We also know that there's a number of people that are not counted in these numbers. So it gives us some insight that the numbers are actually a bit more higher than in terms of what we need to be concerned about. So we'll go to the next slide to dive a little bit deeper in incidence of core housing need in Canada. So when we look at core housing needs and we see the overall number, as I mentioned, over 12% overall for households. But when we dig a little bit deeper, it really becomes very evident that the incidence of core housing needs is much more prevalent among certain population groups. When we look at renters versus owners, for example, we have almost 27% of renters who are facing core housing need, who are struggling to, who really paying too much and not living in adequate housing situations, compared to owners, which is about 6%. When we look at other population groups, so for example, lone parent households, it's almost 40% for renters. And it's even higher when you look at lone parent households who are led by women. The same thing for seniors. Again, when there are seniors, particularly seniors that are women, seniors that are on fixed income, quite a high proportion are facing core housing needs in our country. Similarly, immigrant households, Black Canadians. So it's really important for us to have this data so that we can have a better understanding of who actually is facing core housing need in our country, and then what do we need to address those housing needs. If I go to the next slide to just hone in on a couple of key issues related to access to housing, there's two really categories that I wanted to emphasize. One is around housing needs and one is around housing supply. So housing needs really focus on the most vulnerable, including women and children, and those fleeing domestic violence, seniors, housing with people with disabilities, homeless individuals, Indigenous people, really facing those greatest housing needs, but also lagging housing supply. And we've heard a lot about that, especially during COVID, and I'll go into that a little bit more. So on the vulnerable side, when we look at key issues related to access to housing, and when we look at renters are really worse off when we look at the core housing need that they face and the situation in which they have sometimes limited housing options, and it does contribute further to wealth inequality. In addition to those that are facing core housing need, of course, we also have individuals within our communities who don't have any housing, and they are not counted in the number of core housing needs. And so these are individuals that are facing homelessness. We have a number here of almost 35,000 people experiencing homelessness, but we have other statistics that show us that it could be as high as 200,000 homeless, depending on the counts, and there's hidden homelessness as well. We have Indigenous households in our country who are really experiencing inadequate housing in terms of the quality of the housing, the affordability of the housing, and they're overrepresented in the homelessness populations. We also have Canadians that are really increased financial stress that they're experiencing and fairly high debt levels within Canada. And then as we look at COVID, we haven't seen necessarily that new issues have come up, but it's really an intensification of the issues that have existed. So individuals that were homeless or already in unstable housing situations, those issues were only amplified during COVID, because when everybody was told to stay home or told to socially distance, that obviously is very difficult if you don't have a home or if you live in overcrowded situations. So these are some of the high-level challenges that we know people are struggling with on the most vulnerable populations. Then when we look at housing supply overall for Canadians, when we look at new supply that gets added to the Canadian markets versus the population growth, we've seen that there's been a lag really over quite a few years, where the supply is not keeping up with the population growth. Similarly, what we see is that the income growth is not keeping up with the house price growth. And we've seen that even so more now through COVID, not just in the Canadian context, but we see it in a lot of other countries where I think, to surprise of a lot of us, the demand has very much increased and house prices have really gone through the roof. Incomes, of course, have not kept pace with that, nor has supply. So, for example, in Canada, we've seen people looking to buy bigger homes because they were working from home and learning from home, and they wanted to have more comfort in their homes. So we saw a greater demand for that. We've seen house prices go up in areas where they haven't gone up because people were able to move to places further out, away from urban areas, and live in more rural areas. And there we're seeing house prices go up now. The other issue that we're seeing as it relates to the housing supply is related to the existing housing stock. So we have a large existing privately owned rental housing stock that really provides an important housing option for many Canadians, especially those in lower income brackets. But what we're seeing now is that even that housing stock is at risk of erosion. So really important that we preserve that stock. And that's happening through either conversion, demolition, or by way of rental rates increasing. And sometimes that happens when those buildings change hands, or owners for various reasons raise their rents. And of course, that creates the risk of displacing Canadians as well. And as we're seeing with limited housing options and lagging housing supply, it really does not provide a path for home ownership, especially for those trying to enter the housing markets. While at the same time, for lower income households, they continue to really face housing needs and are in need of affordable housing options. So that's really hopefully paints a bit of a picture of the realities, the key issues that we at CMHC are very seized with, that we monitor, that we talk to a lot of experts on the ground about, other academics, housing providers, industry associations, just to keep a really good handle on what's happening out there in terms of housing issues, and what can we as a federal government do. So this is going to bring me into the next part of the presentation around the National Housing Strategy. So a lot of what I talked about and some of these issues are not new, and they've been around for quite some time. There was a big effort that was made in 2017, actually starting in 2016, when the government of Canada made a new commitment to launch a national housing strategy. So through CMHC and through the federal government, we've had significant investments of housing over the decades, but some of those investments had tapered off over the years. So there was really a renewed investment in housing and a renewed priority on housing starting in 2016, 2017. So we undertook very extensive consultations at the time to really talk to Canadians and other experts in the housing sector to get our understanding of what are some of the big housing issues out there, what are some of the solutions that are needed, what should we be focusing on as a federal government in terms of the role that we can play to address housing issues within Canada. So the National Housing Strategy was launched by the Canadian government in 2017. It has grown over time with subsequent investments and commitments. We now refer to it as a $70 billion plan with a 10-year funding profile. Some of that funding actually includes provincial dollars as well, because provinces and territories within Canada are very much a partner to the federal government. What's really important to mention as well is that the National Housing Strategy is founded on a human rights-based approach to housing. So a National Housing Strategy Act was introduced in 2019, where government is making that commitment to progressively realize the right to adequate housing in Canada. And so really the initiatives that we put forward are really founded on that human rights-based approach to housing, where we put the housing needs of Canadians first to build solutions around that. And what the National Housing Strategy is, it provides really a toolbox approach with to address housing needs. So one of the things that we started with and that we came out with through the consultations we did was a vision for housing in Canada. Like, what does that mean? And what is really the National Housing Strategy at the core of it? So the vision here is to ensure that Canadians have housing that meets their needs and that they can afford. We also very much see affordable housing as a cornerstone of sustainable communities, inclusive society, and very much a strong economy. And we see that out in the key principles of the National Housing Strategy. This is about people, communities, and partnerships. So people relates to the notion that people have to be at the center of this. This is to improve outcomes, social outcomes, economic outcomes for people, and people in various different income groups, people across different population groups. So that's very much at the center of the National Housing Strategy. It's about communities, building communities that are inclusive, building communities where people have access to amenities and jobs, and it's about partnerships. Housing is very capital intense. Housing is all about partnerships and bringing everybody else along to tackle some of these big challenges and big investments. And there's a lot of expertise across the country and across different sectors. So when we look at the National Housing Strategy and the programs on the National Housing Strategy, it really covers the continuum of housing needs. So from shelters through to supportive housing, social housing, up to market housing. The types of support that we provide through various different programs are really along these buckets over here. So we provide funding, so through contributions or financing through low-cost loans, either to create new housing, to repair existing housing, to support existing community housing providers in their capacity, as well as to do innovation and research and have data initiatives. And then we also provide direct affordability support that goes through Canadians. So that's the type of support through various programs. And I'll highlight a few programs. Again, this shows a snapshot of all of the various components of the toolkit or the toolbox of the National Housing Strategy. So it's very much around building new construction, repairing the existing stock, supporting the existing community housing stock so that the old social housing stock remains in good condition, people have affordability support. It's about addressing homelessness through the homelessness programming that's available. It is supporting first-time home buyers, and it's also continuing to support the entire sector through data and innovation and research. I'll highlight before I stop a couple of specific initiatives underneath the National Housing Strategy. One of them is the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. And we really talk about this as the flagship initiative under the National Housing Strategy because it is a significant initiative. It provides $13 billion in loans and contributions over 10 years for new construction, as well as for repairs and renewal of existing housing, and very much focused again on partnerships, bringing in other funders, and enabling really housing providers to come in and meet the housing needs that they see most prominent within their communities. So that can be through shelters for women fleeing violence. It can be a mixed income rental project in the community. There's really a variety of housing options that we support through this. So it's very flexible in that regard, and enabling to support the local housing needs. Another one that I'll highlight is the Affordable Housing Innovation Fund. It's a $200 million program over 5 years. It actually just got extended by another 7 years with another $600 million. And what we are able to do through this is really support different funding models, innovative building techniques. It's about the creation of new units, as well as the preservation of existing units. But we're really after demonstrating innovation in the housing sector so that we can demonstrate and hopefully replicate innovation in housing. And then just lastly, I will just highlight what we do for first-time home buyers. There are some particular incentives that were introduced to support first-time home buyer through equity programs. I wanted to add this as a slide because I know there was an interest in this when it comes to wealth creation and wealth generation. So there is support under the National Housing Strategy as well for first-time home buyers. So I will leave it at that. I have another slide here that shows the timeline of not just the National Housing Strategy launch, but subsequent investments that our government has made to continue to meet needs. And then we have a fantastic website with a lot of information about our various initiatives that really shows the commitment and some of the innovation as it relates to housing to help address the needs of Canadians. So I'll stop there and turn it over back to you.
Great.
I'm happy
Thank you
to
so
do
much, Patricia.
later on.
Yeah, this is particularly of interest to me, living in Canada, so this is fantastic to see. And again, one of the goals of the session this morning is to sort of compare and contrast the situation and the strategies in the various parts of the world. So this is, I think, of interest to all of us who are on this in the session, involved in the session. Right, thank you. So we'll move to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Lieu. And Mr. Lieu is a specialist in infrastructure and its financing. He's director of the China program at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and of the Peking University Lincoln Institute Center for Urban Development and Land Policy in Beijing. Previously, as an infrastructure specialist at the World Bank, he had operational experience in East Asia and South Asia, where he managed investment and lending projects and analytical and advisory activities in the infrastructure and urban sectors. Before joining the World Bank, he was a research associate with the Harvard Institute for International Development, and he's also taught city and regional planning as a faculty member at Nanjing University. Mr. Lieu has authored and co-authored a number of academic papers and World Bank reports on topics including metropolitan infrastructure financing, low carbon city development, sustainable urban transport, motorization, poverty, and transport. He holds a BS from Zhongzhen University, an MS from Nanjing University, and a PhD from Harvard University. In 2010, he served as the vice chair of the Global Agenda Council for the Future of Transportation, the World Economic Forum. And in 2015-16, he served as a member of the expert committee for China's 13th five-year National Social Economic Development Plan. So please join me in welcoming Lieu, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Gianni, for your introduction. I am sitting in the city of Shenzhen and a hotel in Shenzhen, and I'm here to run a training program this week. But it's good that I'm able to join this conference with the not so reliable internet access from the hotel. And so far so good. And I hope the quality of the internet connection continue to be good for next hour or so. Now today I speak without a PPT, but I would give an overview of the housing policy and market evolution in China and how China have gone from a long way to a major problem in housing affordability today. And the first dividing line is year 1998. Before then, China's urban housing provision is very much on welfare to the urban employee, even though shortage was the characteristic of that period. And after 1998, housing provision in cities moved to the market. And so we start to have what we call the commodity housing. Then in year 2004, the central government designate and the housing sector as one of the pillar industries of the national economy. And since then, China have gone through a 10-year housing boom, almost in every cities until 2013 and 2014, when we realized that we had a major problem in the housing market. Now, back in year 2013, and the key problem is a very high housing price in the major cities in China. And price income ratio reached 30, which means the price of the housing is about 30 times of the annual income of the household. And that's how we define the price income ratio. So for the city with the highest housing market price, and then price income ratio is high, over 20 and reaching about 30. And then on the other hand, in the smaller cities, we had seen a major inventory in the housing supply, because the real estate sector treat the sector as economic production instead of producing the housing for the people who need it. And so we got a major inventory which would require a number of years to absorb. So that was the situation in year 2013, 2014, the end of the 10-year golden housing boom. Then in year 2016, presidency issued a new policy, and we call the new housing policy. And that call for housing is built for occupancy instead of for speculation. And the high housing price in the major cities are the result of housing speculation. Now, this is one of the major factors. There are many other factors that drive up the housing prices. And so over the last few years, and even though we have a new housing policy to control the phenomenon of housing speculation that drive up the housing prices in the major cities, but we also see a major issue in housing access and housing affordability for the people who do not have the residential registration in the city where they live. As many of you know, And China has this so-called hukou system. People are identified with their residential places. And if they hold a residential registration in the city, they will have easier access to the housing market and to the government offer the access affordable housing. But if you do not have the residential registration in that city, and you are not qualified and to obtain the affordable housing provided by the local government. But that's the situation for most migrant neighbors who move to the city to work and actually live in the city for many years. So this major housing divide is the key characteristic of our housing sector problem in the major cities. Now, how to deal with this major gap? And today we see the housing divide is getting bigger and bigger in the top 5 or 6 cities, and price income ratio reach very high level. I mean, some numbers show it could be as high as 40. But we also have some major cities where the housing price income ratio is much lower, around 10 or so. And by the international standard, this price income ratio is high, but comparing to the top cities in China, I mean, price income ratio at around 10 is still reasonable. So here we focus on the housing access and affordability issues for the major cities, mainly because there are many migrant neighbors who live and work in the city without access to affordable housing. Now, recently, the way the Chinese government encouraged the local government to deal with this problem is to expand the public expenditure in affordable housing and provide as many housing units and to the low-income people as possible. But on the other hand, China's economy is now moving up the value chain, and the major cities are phasing out the low-level manufacturing job and moving to the high value-added industry jobs. Because of that, and these major cities attract a large number of college graduates. I mean, graduate students who just graduated from the graduate programs from university. And these are the young blood to the high-skilled labor force who come to the city without any ability to get the commodity housing. But the local government have a strong incentive to attract these young tenants to the city. So they use the affordable housing program as the major incentive to attract the young tenant to the city. Now, this strategy is good for the tenants, for the city that want to attract the young tenant and to boost the IT sector, to boost the knowledge economy and the creative sector. But the affordable housing program for the tenants and basically squeeze out the access to the affordable housing by the migrant neighbors. And so that's the major issue Chinese cities are facing. I'm in Shenzhen, and the housing affordability issue is the most acute in the city of Shenzhen, which is next to Hong Kong. And so I will take Shenzhen as the example. Now, the housing price is the highest in Shenzhen among all Chinese cities. But Shenzhen is also an innovation city, IT city, and a knowledge economy city. And the city attracts, believe it or not, 300,000 tenants, and these are the college graduates 300,000 people a year. And these people come to Shenzhen and they like the economic sector here. And they also like the affordable housing program for the tenants, because at least the city of Shenzhen is able to provide affordable housing, the public rental housing for 300,000 young tenants every year for the last few years. And remember, Shenzhen is the richest city in China, and they can do this is good for the city. But on the other hand, Shenzhen also has a large number of migrant neighbors. The city today has a 20 million population, and about half of the population are migrant neighbors, and they stay in the urban villages, because when the Chinese city expand, they took the rural land, but keep the villages intact. And then the farmer lose their rural land and they build their house high in their homestead land in order to lease it out for the migrant neighbors. So the urban villages are actually the homes for millions of migrant neighbors. But for some years, the city of Shenzhen and also some other cities in the southern part of China and try to regenerate the urban villages, because they feel the urban villages do not look good for the city. So, and also the location of the urban villages gradually become fairly central. So the value of the land is high. The city government want to clear the urban village and rebuild the place into a high income neighborhood. And what happened is gentrification. Now the middle income and high income people come in and to buy the commodity houses that was built in the previously the urban villages, while the migrant neighbors are squeezed out to the fringe area of the city, and their living condition is seriously affected. But by the end of the day, and we have a very high housing price for the high income people who own the house, and they are happy because they see the housing price continue to increase. Now for the young tenants, they are able to come to work in Shenzhen thanks to the government affordable housing program for the young tenants. But the housing access become a major issue for the migrant neighbors, and partly because the local government had this urban regeneration program targeted to the urban villages. And so over time, the city of Shenzhen finally realized this is not a good way to go. So today they decide to maintain the urban villages. They only do the kind of site and services to improve the basic infrastructure services for the urban villages, and so that the people who live there and can live in a place with basic infrastructure and also a certain degree of safety. And this is the way to keep the migrant neighbors in the city. Now, on the other hand, the city of Shenzhen is leading China in affordable housing provision. 2 years ago, the city decided for any additional housing provision every year in Shenzhen, the proportion is 60% for affordable housing and 40% for commodity housing. So this policy, hopefully, after some years, will change the structure of the housing market. So more and more people will be able to enjoy the public rental housing, and while fewer people will have access to the commodity housing. And also the city of Shenzhen find many ways to control and stabilize the commodity housing market in order to stop the crazy rise of the housing prices, and that lasts for so many years. So this is the case for Shenzhen. But of course, Shenzhen is rich, and the city is able to do some of the things that other cities in China cannot do. But I believe Shenzhen is the city that set the pace or set the example for the major cities in China to deal with the affordable housing access and affordability issue. I guess I run out of my time, so I will stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Lieu. That's very, very helpful. A great overview of the state of things in China, and lots of questions I've got already for you. So, but we're going to hold questions and discussion until all four presenters have presented. So I'm going to turn it over to Allan now, and Allan will introduce our next speaker, who is Anna Claudia Rosbach. Allan?
Apologies, I had lost the sound. Yes, I'm very pleased to present the next speaker, Anna Claudia Rosbach. Anna Claudia is the regional manager for Latin America and the Caribbean for Cities Alliance, normally based in Mexico, though at the present time she's in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Cities Alliance is a global partnership fighting urban poverty and promoting the role of cities. Cities Alliance supports national and local governments to develop policies, strengthen capacity, undertake strategic planning and investments. The partnership, the Cities Alliance partnership, includes representation from communities through Slum Dwellers International, municipalities through UCLG, and international organizations like UN Habitat. Anna Claudia is from Sao Paulo, Brazil, holds a master's degree in political economy, and has been working for 20 years in the housing and urban fields. As a practitioner, a researcher for international organizations, local and national governments, universities, and nonprofit organizations. During her professional life, she's worked in the urban sector in Brazil and a number of Latin American countries, in Asia, in the Philippines, China, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, in Africa, in Mozambique, Angola, where I've met her first, and Egypt, Namibia, and South Africa. During the Habitat 3 process, she acted as an expert for the policy unit on national urban policies. And currently she's the regional manager for Latin America and the Caribbean, based in Mexico City. So over to Anna Claudia.
Thank you, Allan. It's very rare that I hear to my full bio like you did. But yes, I was just thinking, thank you, Patricia and Zil for your presentations. I learned a lot about Canada and China. Thank you, Benjamin, Allan, for the invitation. Keisha, also an old friend in this panel. I wish I could have chosen an easier field of action because after hearing about the situation in Canada and China and now sharing about Latin America, yeah, we have a huge challenge, right? And especially after COVID, the situation is not easy for us at all at the global level. But yes, I was asked to present about Latin America, so what's going on. So I prepared a set of slides, and first of all, about Latin America, right? So what is the context and where are the conditions where we need to provide or expand the supply of affordable housing? So we have a region with structural inequalities. It's the most unequal region in the world, the most violent, right? A context of high levels of urban poverty and being expanded through COVID. We have a prevalence of informality, both economic informality of labor and land. So this is actually not an exception, but one could say even, you know, the majority now of the situation here. We have markets that are dysfunctional and highly regulated or completely not regulated in different countries, right? And we have very segregated cities. So the inequalities in Latin America are visible. You can walk through our cities and you can see the segregation. But we do have a trajectory of policies. We have a trajectory of massive scale housing policies like Chile, Brazil, Mexico, who have built millions of houses, 7 million in Mexico, 5 million in Brazil, 4 million in Chile, millions of houses in the last, let's say, 2 decades, but it's still a huge housing deficit. We have a history of, in some countries, some neighborhood slum upgrading, improvements and connections to the city. So we do have policies in place. Well, what is affordable housing in Latin America, right? I believe here affordable housing only exists in two compositions. One is spontaneous self-production, so people producing and building by themselves. I think this is the most important, source or most prevalent source of, provision of affordable housing in Latin America. Houses that are self-built. We call them social production of housing and habitat. They are spontaneous in some places. In many places, they are informal, precarious. In other places, they are, semi-precarious. But in all cases, the integration to the city is very fragmented. And another source of affordable housing are the subsidized housing policies. As I said, these 3 countries, but also Colombia has programs, Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, they all have some kind of subsidies programs that work as a bridge, between the formal markets, and the affordability levels. Here you can see some of the pictures, right? Housing co-ops in Uruguay, which are a very solid way of promoting and providing affordable housing, public subsidized housing in Mexico. You have home improvements in Brazil and in Colombia and Chile. So these are the means we have here in this region to provide affordable housing. But we still have a huge problem of around 120 million people living in precarious and informal settlements. I was just comparing, Patricia, with the numbers that you provided, homelessness and people living in precarious conditions. So this is a massive issue here for Latin America. The most predominant deficit is qualitative, but however, there's a study from Veronica from the Inter-American Development Bank and Felipe, and they say that 90% of the solutions offered are still construction of new units. We have been built millions of houses, but still having this qualitative deficit. Well, what's happening to the markets after the pandemic? Of course, we still have these structural gaps in terms of limitation of income. So the difference between the income and the price of the houses, like similar to China, right? So we do have that. So people either build by themselves or they need to rely on subsidies. We have housing finance systems that are very highly regulated in many countries, and if they weren't, probably we wouldn't have any provision of credit for affordable housing, because it's a very risky business. It has been improving in the last year, though, in some countries. And we do have a strong public sector participation to enable markets. We have regulations, we have incentives, we have subsidies. So there's a huge push, in terms of policy, planning incentives at city level, national level, subsidies, to make the markets work. Nevertheless, after the pandemic, what we are observing, this is an information about Brazil. You don't have to understand the currency. You don't have to understand the words in Portuguese there. But what you can understand is, the amount of credit of real estate credit that we have been providing over the last years. And you see that 2020 is a record. The same thing happened in Colombia. So we are, we are selling a lot. So construction markets are booming in Brazil, booming in Colombia, booming in some countries in Latin America, but it's not reaching, the poor. It's not affordable. It's only for a very limited public. So we are facing historic records right now, but still limited to a very small percentage of the population. I don't have the accurate data, but one could say that formal markets only reach out to 5 to 10% of the population in the overall region, and the rest doesn't have access to formal markets unless the house is subsidized. So this is the situation. So the outreach of the markets is very, very, very small. And the reality that we face post-pandemic, like Canada, like China, Africa, Asia will come after, is very similar. So Latin America has been very affected by the pandemic. One of the the most affected regions, if not the most affected region in the world by the pandemic. So we have, more than 1 million people. Half of those live here in Brazil that already died because of COVID. It's affecting our GDP hugely. So fiscal pressures for the subsidies, for these public policies instruments that I just presented, both at the national and city level. There are calculations from ECLAC, from CEPAL Latin America, that we are delaying, our exit strategies from poverty and extreme poverty. They say about 12 years delay from the pandemic. We have an expansion of unemployment, one expansion of people living in conditions of economic vulnerability, and this is visible. I walk here in São Paulo and I see much more people living on the streets, and I hear from people working in informal settlements, in informal occupations in the central area of the city, that there are many people who are not being able to afford a rent right now. They have to move out from their houses and move into informal settlements. So the informality is growing. We also have information through MINURVI, the national forum, the Forum of National Authorities in Latin America, that informal settlement expansion is being observed in countries like Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, everywhere. So this is the reality post-pandemic. We have a small formal market that is booming, that is achieving records of sales, but then we have an expansion of the households, of the population, who is not able to pay for that. So the gap is increasing, is expanding, right? So what's the shift that we are observing right now? So as presented by both Z and Patricia, and I believe this is a trend everywhere. We have diverse housing policies. So the diversity of solutions, of instruments of policy to attend the different niches is improving, is increasing. So for instance, migrants, so Chile, Colombia, countries that are very affected by migration, they are designing, Brazil, designing special housing programs for migrants, elderly people, young people. There's also a stronger recognition and support of the spontaneous and social production of housing. This is the case of Mexico, who is shifting from building housing of subsidized, fully new houses towards more home improvements and expansions and self-build. Also, Brazil is working on this shift. Argentina. We see investments in improving infrastructure of existing houses to improve the quality of not only the house, but the infrastructure, then the integration to the city. Some innovative rental housing models coming on, and kind of new trends of financial solutions. So there's this investment activism, I'm using this wording that I heard recently, right? Kind of smaller scale financial innovations that are popping out here and there. I brought you some examples of innovations that are taking place. So you see this social rental model in Colombia. So it's basically a cash transfer, you know, a voucher, rental voucher to families to enable them to increase their savings for a couple of years until they are able, you know, to buy a new home, to enter the formal market. So it's basically a support for families living in rental conditions in this transition from rental to property. Apparently it's working well. So it's a program that was launched around 3 years ago. Chile has been implementing rental vouchers for a couple of years already, if I'm not mistaken, the last 5-6 years. But now, well, they're changing, and especially because the issues that I just mentioned. So people affected by COVID, migration, expansion of informal settlements in Chile. So they are adapting their housing subsidy, their voucher, the rental voucher subsidy, to also attend this population, families affected by climate disasters, for instance. So it's basically a program that is strong on the demand side. So the beneficiary can choose a house and is subsidized for a long period. So it's a strong support from the government, like all models that we saw before. So you see a strong hand from the government here in terms of, you know, providing a comprehensive scheme that connects here, in this case, the financial system, the beneficiaries, the private owners, and also strong subsidy in place, right? So this model is expanding. I think they are also looking to public rental, also to attend some special niches or some places where there are no options in terms of supply of rental houses. Of course, Chile is able to do that because for years, the government subsidized low-income houses. So they built, you know, a contingent of houses that can be now offered in the markets for rental. This situation in Chile is not the same in many other countries in Latin America. So this type of program can take place in Chile because we do have this stock. It's not applicable to other countries that don't have a supply of low-income housing. Mexico, as I mentioned, created this platform to support, you know, the self-build of houses, improvement, expansion. They're investing a lot in new credit lines for this type of investments. They changed a lot the criteria for selection, the risk analysis, and so on, accepting different types of families, different types of unions, you know, co-housing. So there's a whole shift in, you know, designing new credit lines and a new approach and this big platform to connect the value chain so that people can find the materials, can find the technical assistance, you know, and can find the opportunities in different locations in Mexico. And this is a small example from Brazil. I'm just finishing my presentation. I call it investment activism. It was a small NGO. They were able to leverage $1 million from private crowded investments, created a credit facility. They have these stores in a couple of informal settlements in São Paulo, and I believe they are now expanding to other cities as well. They offer technical assistance to home improvement and expansion solely based on private investments, not subsidized by the government. This is very, very small scale, but it has potential for scaling up if there are policies, if the policy environment changes. But the main shift I'm observing here is the shift at the local level. So improving planning, improving capacity of cities to identify and expand the supply of land, well-located, served land for affordable housing. And with that, I finish my presentation, Allan. No, sorry, I forgot Peru. But yes, yeah, this is a new model that was just proposed. It's not in place yet, but it's also this combination of densification of peripheric areas, improvement of home, and creation of income opportunities through rental housing. This is not in place yet, but this is following the same line of thought. Yeah, I think that's it, Allan.
Thanks very much, Ana Claudia. I'd now like to have the pleasure of introducing Kecia Rust. Kecia is the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, CAF. She's a housing policy specialist and has provided strategic support to governments in Southern Africa in the development of national, provincial, and local housing policy over the last 20 years. She was the housing finance coordinator at Finmark Trust from 2003 to 2014, at the time that CAF was established. CAF is a think tank that aims to find ways to make housing financial markets in Africa work for the poor. I've followed Kecia's work over the last 7 or 8 years as she built CAF into a really remarkable, dynamic, continent-wide network that undertakes cutting-edge research, disseminates knowledge, and truly helps drive innovation in the African housing markets. Kecia's experience in the housing sector is broad. Over the span of her career, she has focused on affordable housing finance, residential property assets, property markets, rental and social housing, and the creation of sustainable human settlements. Kecia participated in Wharton School's International Housing Finance Program in Philadelphia in 2007. She has a Master's of Management degree from the University of Wits in Johannesburg, and a bachelor's degree from Chapel Hill in the US. Over to Kecia. Thanks.
Allan, thank you very much for, yes, like Anna said, for that very long introduction I haven't heard for some time. It's really lovely to be with all of you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to participate with you all in discussion. There's so much for us to talk about. And one of the things that, in fact, Anna and I were chatting about was just, I mean, it's enough when there's a housing crisis in your own country. But if it actually extends everywhere, it is a bit overwhelming. So I think this was a really good initiative on your part to bring us all together to share notes and see where we maybe can rustle the system a little bit, because we're still here. Let me share my screen and put it onto slideshow. There we go. Okay, so just some comments about Africa's affordable housing markets. So much of what Anna said is echoed in this presentation. And we have very different markets to what was described in Canada and China. I look at what was described for Canada, and I just think those resources, that would be very nice. And the strength of government in other contexts as well. And we have very few resources and relatively, I would say, weak governments. And so in that context, there's a lot of challenges. And you'll hear as I speak and share some of what we're seeing, that I look very much at regular, normal people to figure out how they can solve their housing situation themselves, oftentimes despite policy, because policy is a very, very slow animal. So we need to work and support that. But in some ways, my emphasis around policy is about enabling rather than driving, because the resources just aren't there for the level of subsidization that I would like to say would be needed. So just to show you, I don't know if everyone can see this properly on the screen, but what CAF does every year, we put together a yearbook. It comes out every November. The URL for it is right there, where we summarize the housing situation in all 55 countries across this continent in a profile of 4 pages in length, but emphasizing the question of affordable housing. And one of the questions that we ask our consultants, so we work with about 45 consultants across all 55 countries, and we ask them to tell us what is the price of the cheapest newly built house built by a formal developer this year. Now, I can't stand entirely behind those numbers because it's based on what a consultant is identifying in their local context, but we're relying on their expertise. So in this graph, last year is in orange and the year previous is in gray. And what you can see there is that the most expensive house last year was apparently in Tanzania. That's one of the poorest countries. It was $80,000. All the way down to the cheapest house in Africa last year, officially, was an $8,040 house built about 30 kilometers or so outside of the center of Abuja in Nigeria. And I'll come back to that just now. So you can see quite a range. The bulk of so-called affordable housing that's built by private sector developers costs between the range of $20,000 to $40,000. So a completely different scale to Canada and China as well in this context. But these are the numbers we're working with. From a financing perspective, though, you'll see quite soon that even $20,000 is a very expensive house for the majority of households in the countries across the continent. We also collect data on mortgage rates and terms. And so this is looking at all of the countries. The rate is the gray bar, and the term, the number of years of that loan, is the orange dot. And you can see that the rates are very often higher than 10%. In some cases, you can see in Zambia, there you've got a 30% interest rate, 35% interest rate or so. You might as well be buying your house on a credit card at that rate. And if you're imagining amortizing that over anything more than 6 months, it becomes untenable. But in most countries, it's still higher than 10%. Only a handful are below 10%. And those that are in that sort of, there's a couple countries, 2, 3, 5% range, those are subsidized interest rates. The state is already supporting them. And then the loan terms are short because access to long-term finance is also really limited because of the nature of the investment climate. And so that creates a whole new pressure. So when you put those two things together, the cheapest newly built house and then the price of finance, what you get, and then you compare that to what are the incomes across the continent. And here we're looking at urban areas. What we've done is we've built a sort of heat map calculator that calculates the price of the cheapest newly built house. Let's pretend that you can buy it with a mortgage in that particular country as the terms that we found. Now, there aren't necessarily those mortgages accessible, but let's pretend they are. What percentage of the urban population should presumably be able to afford that if we use the 30% rule, which itself I think is debatable. But let's just use all those assumptions. And the picture is really depressing. We've got red is bad news, green is good news, right? So the darker red means the fewer people can actually afford. You can see there that in Nigeria, the cheapest newly built house was $8,040. It was affordable to 68% of the urban population only, and they only built 400. And remarkably, actually, not all of them sold. And there are a whole lot of reasons around that too. But what it does come down to is it's not just about the price of the house, it's also about the price of the finance. Take a look at South Africa at the very bottom, where you've got the cheapest house built by a private sector developer was $31,000, and it's only affordable to a fifth of the urban population in South Africa. And we are a relatively rich country. So there is a real challenge, and that challenge exists across across the continent. What we then did is we said, well, let's take that $8,000 house and let's just pretend that we could build it everywhere, because oftentimes that's what we like to wish, is that that's the problem. And so when you do that, the picture does improve somewhat. We've got more green countries, but even so, affordability is still limited, which means that we actually have to get our head right around what is affordability in real life and what is achievable on this continent. Remember that we have in our cities, we've got some of the fastest urbanization rates. Kampala, I think, is 5% urbanization rates in the world. And so you've got lots of pressure of people coming into the cities, and then you've got these affordability constraints, and you actually you're having to manage the densities and the infrastructure and all of that. So then we've got a whole set of conventional delivery approaches. This is one of my favorite developments for not very good reason. This is called Vision City. And it was built by the Rwanda Social Security Board. So it comes from, built with pension fund money. And it was built as a way in which they were trying to leverage pension money to support affordable housing delivery. They called it affordable. And the initial units were between $100,000 and $500,000 a piece, possibly affordable to, I don't know, a fraction of a percent. At the time, 2% of the urban population in Rwanda could afford a $20,000 house. My other favorite example is in Allan's neighborhood, just outside Luanda. And there, the affordable house was $190,000. So there's this real disconnect between, and here's a pension fund that's doing that. One would think that they would be a little bit thoughtful about the affordability of their client base, the people who are saving with them, and yet they're building something that's completely out of scope. So that's not a very good approach, but it certainly is convention, a sense of we're going to build this image that you would like to see in a magazine, as opposed to something that actually is realistic for households. Another common approach are unfinished buildings, so that you have developments that start with all sorts of enthusiasm, and then they just stall. And there's a financing problem there, and there's also a developer capacity problem. We want to build large-scale developments because we're desperate about the need, a backlog of 17 million units in Nigeria. How are we going to do that if we don't build tens of thousand units at a time? The problem is we don't have developers who actually have the capacity to do that. And in fact, one of the issues that was so exciting about the Colombo development, which was built by a Chinese developer, was that maybe we could learn how to develop at scale in that context. But it actually isn't only about the knowledge, it's the experience and it's the financial capacity of these institutions to be able to do it. And then it's the administrative capacity of the local authority that has to receive this massive development that's just appeared. So we really have trouble with scale at this large scale. And what ends up happening is we're building and then we get stuck halfway through. And this is one of the saddest pictures I think I've ever seen. Maybe not the saddest, but it is pretty sad. So then, as Anna Claudia said, who builds houses actually? Well, it is households themselves. And incremental construction is actually the real conventional approach, and we keep on forgetting to say so. Our policies are designed for big developers. Our financial systems are designed for people with balance sheets and with pay slips and who can prove that they have affordability. And we're not paying attention to the fact that people who seriously just need to make a plan because they have to live somewhere, and they do it beautifully. In many instances, they do. But you'll notice this is not a dense urban area that I've chosen here for this photograph. It's much harder in a dense urban area, such as this. This is downtown Dar es Salaam, and I love this. I took this from my hotel window, and I was amazed at this pastel-colored city. And I never had an idea of Dar es Salaam as a rental city. I didn't think of that. I thought very poor, low levels of per capita GDP. And I hadn't imagined this. Now, many of these units were actually built by the National Housing Corporation in Tanzania years back. And in fact, they're rented out but they're sublet and sublet and sublet, so that the person who's living there is not the tenant that the NHC knows about. It's someone who's sublet to that. What that tells us is that there's flow of money, so that's good news, but you can't find the person. And what ends up happening is the rents are so depressed. And sometimes the person living there is paying the rent, but the person who's the tenant is not paying the rent. And so there isn't a maintenance budget for the National Housing Corporation. And so many of these buildings are falling into terrible disrepair, which is seriously risky when you're high up, right? This is the case in very many cities. And we've looked at some of the data, and it is remarkably difficult to find. We don't know enough about rental on this continent. But anywhere between 30 and 50% of urban populations, and sometimes more, are living in rental accommodation for which there is no policy at the moment. Very few countries actually have rental policies. And then what we find is that in many cases, this blew me away, and the research I would recommend checking out, the URL is there, that the services conditions in these units are terrible. So people are living in really bad conditions, even when they're in formal structures. You would like to say that everyone there is sorted. They're not. They actually need a housing solution too. But what's critical here, and this I think Anna also raised, is they don't need new housing. They need home improvements of different sorts and infrastructure investments. So to go quickly along, looking forward, the things that I like that people are doing. There's a lender in Zambia called Zambian Home Loans. And what they provide is a mortgage loan, so it's a mortgage, for incremental construction. And let's pretend that the whole house would cost $100,000. Well, they will lend out $20,000 in installments, which means that the borrower doesn't have to pay the amortization and the interest costs on that whole $100,000. They only pay every $20,000, which keeps their costs down. At the same time, it means that when people are building themselves, they can access finance. So when they get stuck, they can then access further finance. So their business model, I think, is a really, really interesting one and responds to the way people build in real life, as opposed to what we imagine. Another form of incremental housing, which I'm curious about, and they haven't yet cracked the model. It's the Millard Fuller Foundation, and this is that example in Abuja, the $8,000 house, where they make the outside of the house finished. It's a developer that builds a finished house. The inside of the house is raw. So it's not been plastered inside. You've got wires in the roof. You don't have a ceiling. And you do that incrementally over time. Some of the buyers, though, have balked on that because that doesn't look like a normal house you would see in a magazine. And then why would you want to engage into a long-term mortgage with this? So it's targeted the middle class who have higher aspirations than their affordability can allow. And that's, I think, something they're grappling with. Another example I love is inner city. It's happening in inner cities across South Africa. And this is the Trust for Urban Housing Finance, or TUF. Their logo is this circle on the top right. And what they've done is, just imagine that photograph I showed you of Dar es Salaam. They have identified that as a target market, but in Johannesburg in this case. I'd love to replicate it in Dar es Salaam. And they offer mortgages to small scale landlords who will maybe buy 2 or 3 units at a time and fix them up. And over the course of their operations, they have built more affordable housing in South Africa than the government subsidy program with affordable rental than the government subsidy program with no subsidy. And they're working with small scale landlords and empowering those landlords. So those are generally lower income people as well, sort of lower middle income. And they've created these investment opportunities where those individuals don't have equity. They created this Ntutuku Equity Fund, which is a fund that's targeted at brand new entrepreneurs who don't have cash to put down as equity for their loan. And it supports them until they begin to develop an income stream so that they can pay back the equity. So it's a wonderful model, and I would recommend looking at that. Then you've got much more as Ana Claudia said, the sporadic or spontaneous social production, where you've got investors who are just doing it. No one's helping them, and there isn't a particular loan product that's available, and they're just making it happen. And what's cool about this, and thinking especially about rental, is it is local. It's well located because it's existing stock. And if you're refurbishing existing stock, that can be very powerful, and give you good access to good locations. So I'm very nearly done. Just a quick comment about COVID. It is on everyone's minds and hearts, and it has impacted on people in very, very many terrible ways. But one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is this question of housing quality. And when we talk about households that are living in potentially inadequate housing, so this bar, I don't know if you can see my cursor. If you look at the bottom 40th percentile of households living in Nigeria, 93% of that population is living in potentially inadequate housing. Now that sounds like a headache I just can't cope with, right? It's an enormous number of people. But if I segment out what is the nature of that inadequacy, I can start to address it differently. Some are in informal dwellings, but some are in formal dwellings, but they just don't have a flush toilet. So that's a sanitation response, not a housing response. Some are in perfectly fine dwellings with good sanitation, but they're just very full. They're overcrowded. They just need an extension. And that, in fact, for one person could be a housing crisis. For another, it's an investment opportunity. And if we start to think about small scale investment opportunities and have municipal policy and national policy enable that, it creates a real opportunity. So that, of course, contributes to the impact of housing on GDP. And I won't go through the slide, but just to say it is not insignificant. And when we are in this continent where we have very commodity dependent economies, shifting some of our economic activity domestically in terms of the domestic production of housing and the impact that housing production can have on an economy sounds like it would be a good economic strategy, especially in a post-COVID context. So the potential impact of housing on the economy is significant. I could tell you none of this if we didn't collect the data for it, and we work really hard to do it. We've just launched some work that we did under the banner of a data agenda for housing for Africa, where we piloted an approach in 8 countries, and we built a series of market shaping indicators for what is the information we need to understand the housing investment environment. And so that's available there. And I'll stop there. Our website is full of lots of interesting material. And if there's something you think should be there that isn't, just write to me. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Casey. Yeah. I don't know about Allan, but I'm just blown away and overwhelmed by how much great information isn't out there. And I just, we're already chatting with each other back and forth in the chat room because there's just too many things flying by that we want to ask questions about. So it's fantastic. I think that we do have one question in the Q&A, but I think even among ourselves as a group of panelists, we could probably spend the next hour just talking back and forth on some of these issues. Allan, what do you think? Should we start with the question in the Q&A?
Yes, okay. The question is from Ines Raimundo at Universidad Eduardo Mondlane in Maputo. And the question was directed to Ana Claudia, but I think it could be answered by Kesia equally well. So maybe this is to both Ana Claudia and Kesia. Ines asks about in your work in Africa, both of you, what is your perspective? Is there a difference in the housing markets or the housing culture in the Lusophone countries like Mozambique and Angola compared to the other countries that you're working in?
Should I go first?
Yes, please.
Well, many differences and many similarities in this. I believe, the prevalence of informality, the similarity. And the outreach, right, of the formal markets, I believe it's also a similarity, the limitations, right, of possibilities, the affordability gaps, all very, very similar in our countries. What I think when I look at Latin America, and not only Africa, but other regions from the global south, is that it seems to me that we kind of learn to live with informality. I see that in many countries in the global south, informality is still perceived as something illegal and not proper, not adequate, and so on. And here we kind of learn how to live with that. Informality of land, informality of labor. So there are good and strong policies in place in cities at the national level, you know, to support the proper integration, progressive, gradual integration of this informal, you know, spaces of our cities, or, you know, that's mostly connected, in the majority connected also with the informal economy, right? So to create connections around those and policies that are in place. And at a city level, in countries, for instance, like Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, you do see Ecuador, some cities, you do see, you know, a strong evolution in terms of planning, you know, planning in terms of understanding what's informal, mainstreaming, but also, you know, an holistic view of the city that includes also the places where people live and will live in the future. And this is very helpful, right, for the markets to expand. It is actually a condition for the markets to expand. So this decentralization that we have here is different than in Africa and other places in the world. And for me, it's quite a difference, yeah.
Yeah, Casey,
Over to you, Casey.
Yes.
I mean, I keep on looking at Allan, because I think, Allan, you could probably also say the one point that I think, just to add on to what Ana Claudia was saying, that worries me a little bit. We keep on having this discussion, formal, informal, and I feel that, so the historical context of our countries is what gave rise to the definition of formal. And oftentimes the way in which people do things in real life, I don't know how else to say it, is what we call informal. But that's just because we haven't developed systems to accommodate that as regular. There are, and for me, that's, I mean, what's so encouraging about a decentralized system that really recognizes the role of the city is that the ability to engage with what people on the ground can do themselves is perhaps strengthened. I would hope so. Whereas so many of the countries across this continent, they love to just offer these grand plans from the national level that bear very little relation to how people actually live, especially today. They're based on old systems and structures. That's not just a colonial argument. It also has to do with the structure of economies and who the investors are and what their expectations are. And part of the reason why I like to always put up, we're talking about $80,000 is an expensive house, because we have to get our heads around that. It's a completely different set of equations to what, and in most capital, if it's coming from the north, is going to think $80,000 is pretty cheap. So this debate between formal, informal needs to be challenged at the definitional side, I think.
Right.
Yeah,
The purpose of this panel was really to, oh, go ahead, Ben, sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to wade in saying, for me, informal versus formal has to do with whether or not there's a mortgage involved. In Canada, well, I mean, I spent some time in Peru when I was a lot younger, and obviously almost everything there had rebar sticking out of the top of it, and people, you know, added on if and as they could, and In Canada, you can't do that. Most housing is tied to mortgages, and you don't get a mortgage on an unfinished home. You get a mortgage on a completed home. You get a construction loan on an unfinished home, and a construction loan is at a very high interest rate, and there's huge incentive to get it done quickly so that you can actually negotiate a decent mortgage. So to me, the formal and informal has a lot to do with how the mortgage system is working in the country, but that's just my limited perspective.
I was going to say that the original purpose of this panel was to try to look at the 4 countries, regions that that this conference is dealing with, to see if there are some shared lessons or experiences that could be usefully exchanged. I see in Canada and China that clearly the housing is, as our panelists yesterday, Leilani Farah, would say, financialized or commodified. And in Latin America and Africa, the social production of housing is the predominant sector. And I'm kind of grasping at, is there a dialogue that we can, is there a way of moving towards a stronger housing market without and avoiding the problems of speculation and affordability that we find in countries like China and Canada. I don't know if there are real lessons that we can draw from this session. It would be, I think, we need to do some reflection on these presentations and think about what the lessons are for us.
Well, can I jump right back in, Allan? I mean,
yes.
To me,
yes.
there's this issue. I mean, I don't know. She didn't quite describe it as such, but China created a middle class on the back of its housing market because in a sense it moved everyone from rentalship to ownership very quickly, and then then the market, the value of housing went way up, and everyone all of a sudden became rich, and the world is full of, as we now say, filthy rich Asians moving around with massive amounts of money. So one wonders to some degree, and I think Canada to a large degree said that too, that coming out of the Second World War, there were major housing shortages. The idea was that the private sector would address it, and that you'd move as many people to ownership as you possibly could for a variety of reasons. But that shift to ownership created, in effect, what is the middle class Canada today. That middle class is really under threat now because the next generation is going to have a lot of difficulty moving into ownership, and that's Patricia's problem and my reality. But that's a big part of it. To me, the issue, and I always come back to this, is that, yeah, it's one thing to offer shelter to people, and that's an extremely important thing. But if you don't offer them opportunities to benefit from the increase in land value or the increase in property value, poverty just gets perpetuated. And I'm always confused when I'm hearing various examples as to whether we're talking about ownership or whether we're talking about rental, or whether we're talking about rent to own or some kind of equity stake in a rental apartment. And anyway, so I throw that out there. I don't know where I'm going with all this, but I think that's one of the things we can talk about a little bit. My question to Lieu is, what about these 300,000 young people coming to Shenzhen? Yes, thank God they're given access to something that they can afford, but how are they ever going to get from there into commodity housing or to ownership? I mean, that gap seems just getting wider and wider and wider. Whereas in Africa and South America, I think there's this blurred boundary, and this comes back to Keisha a little bit, between what's ownership, what's rental, what's formal, what's informal, and how do you jump those gaps? Anyway, I see 2 hands up. Anna Claudia, I think yours was up first.
Yeah, no, we have many dilemmas, right? But Benjamin, maybe we cannot see the solution right now, because the solution will be different of something that we have right now or we even imagine, right? So we have different types of and modes of housing, and new generations, they think differently than we think, right? So you have this co-housing, you have different, models of, the globalization. I live here, I work there, and we're all connected. So I believe that we are now seeing an emergence of different types and modes of life that will orient the markets and the policies in the future. And maybe we won't have this debate, you know, property ownership versus, also in Latin America, ownership had played a big role for the emergence of a middle class that is now being threatened by COVID, right? So ownership in places where we don't have a strong social protection, ownership has played and is been playing a big role in Latin America. I'm not discarding this one, but it's just seeing that niches are arising and different types are arising, and we need to keep a look at that, at this small trends, right, and use from our different fronts to promote the changes, the policy changes that Keisha is talking about, you know, in order to sustain this innovations. I think what we had in the past didn't work. So the commodity speculation, we have speculation here in Latin America as well, in the inner cities, so speculation is everywhere. What we need is to build consensus around the social function of the city, the social function of the land, and create regulations around that. Because the city, the property, the land has to work for the collectively, right? Yeah. Not for individuals only. And I think there is a structural change that we need to make. And it's not easy.
Thank you. Keisha, you're next.
Thanks for that. Yeah, no, it isn't easy. I think that the where I've come to think a lot and see so much example of it is that the expectation that we go large scale in some ways undermines so much else, because it doesn't enable the fixation of policy, of finance and everything on the large scale means that the regular activity of households and small scale builders, micro builders, small scale landlords, all of that isn't happening. And what's so important about their activity is both in terms of housing production, but also in terms of their own economic growth and wealth creation. So when we talk about rental as an important component of a housing market in a city, it absolutely can also contribute to the goals, Ben, that you're talking about, because that rental housing can be offered by households who, through that exercise, find themselves then in the middle class. And we badly need a middle class to stabilize and support the growth of our cities. The opportunity for housing to be a feature of the economic sector is very often overlooked by policy. So policy sees it as shelter. And we talk about backlogs and we reinforce that in many ways with the kinds of, when we also in terms of our SDG indicators as well, that the emphasis of the housing SDG indicators is on whether or not that is built as opposed to how that's functioning. And we need to remember that as well, is how that market does function. Within that, what we need is really strong governments that can manage the tensions that will emerge, because the competition around land resources, that's a regulatory function to manage that. And I fear that many of the countries, cities on this continent are not yet in a place to engage with that adequately. Your question about how to bring together the Canadian and the Chinese story and the Latin American and the African story, it is difficult, but I think it does come down to, I would say, the role of that small scale player and their ability to participate in a housing economy, and then the role of the state to make that possible rather than to inhibit it, which often is what's happening.
Yeah, G, you've got your hand up too. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I think the discussion is focused on what we can find in common among China, Canada, and Latin America, and Africa. I try to characterize the issues that we have. I would like to say, when we look at the housing sector in a city, and we have a formal market, and like the commodity housing market in the Chinese city. And then we have the government provided affordable housing program. And then we have an informal housing market. So these are the three elements that I would like to characterize the housing sector in our cities. which may be similar in Latin America and in Africa. Now, I don't know so much about these two geographical regions very much, but still, I understand there are a lot of informalities. And I have been to Africa and also Latin America. So I have seen personally a lot of informal housing in these regions. Today in China, we come to realize that the informal housing market actually play a very strong social function because it offers the home to the people who are not able to afford the housing from the commodity market and who have no access to the government provided affordable housing services. So it is the informal housing market and that offer the chance, access for housing for this group of people. Of course, in the future, the city will continue to grow, will continue to modernize. Some of the informal housing market may be formalized, but I think we will need to be more careful about this. And the lesson we can learn from Latin American countries is that the informal housing market is great for many low-income people. And I think China can learn from Latin America, or perhaps Africa, about the tolerance to the informal market functions. This is what I have in my mind after listening to the presentation of our friends.
Thank you. I'm going to put Patricia on the spot here, and we probably shouldn't spend too much more time because we've gone a bit over. But Patricia, back to you. I keep thinking full circle to Canada, and it'd be wonderful if you could draw on your knowledge of the Netherlands too, which we all look to as a sort of paragon of orderly housing production and a happy society. So over to you.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and I studied planning there before I came to North America. And yes, very orderly, and there's no other choice but to be orderly because it's such a small country. So you have to be super organized and to enable good housing solutions for all those for all the people there. But I have to say, I do read about the news and and we do a lot of comparative research looking at other countries as well. When we look at the housing market in Canada, but even what's happening in some European market, it's pretty amazing how we're all struggling with very similar challenges. I'm even seeing in areas in the Netherlands where now investors actually are buying up properties, or foreigners, I guess, from other neighboring countries that are coming in and buying up property, where people are really struggling to find just affordable housing in their own community. And we're talking about that quite a bit in Canada as well. When I was in the States about 10, 15 years ago, the whole notion of workforce housing was a big one, and that keeps them coming back, where if you cannot have people who serve your community live in your community, that's going to have an impact on everybody. There's such not just a social argument for the affordability of housing, but also an economic argument, of course. We're very much about building these communities that are inclusive and sustainable, and it requires really housing options across the continuum. And back to just the tenure option, or the tenure question earlier around homeownership, and it becomes harder and harder to get into that. Of course, we are starting to see different forms of tenure and starting to explore that as well. And as Ana Claudia was talking about, I think there are maybe younger generations who are seeing benefits, and not only striving for home ownership, but there's benefits in other forms, whether that's cooperative or co-living, or we talked about rent to own. So this is really one of the benefits of having these conversations and looking at different models, and exploring what else can we offer in terms of housing?
Allan, do you want to close us out?
Well, I think we've got somewhere towards some lessons. I think Casey basically identified the governance issue as a fundamental one, and that possibly the characteristics of certainly the African in the African context of weak governance. We have also weak housing markets, and in many cases weak land tenure. So I think that is one of the lessons that we can draw. The other is the incremental innovations of incremental housing, where there is a combination of financializing the housing process through incremental loans or incremental mortgages, microfinance. We've been experimenting with. Are some of the lessons where there are some hybrid models that moving towards a more developed affordable housing market. So Ben, over to you to end things off.
One last observation. I think it was something that Casey said at the end, which is I think of the origin in North America, both of the FHA and the CMHC here in Canada. The origin was always really about, well, they go back to the Depression, and it was about an economy that had collapsed and the prospect of using housing to kind of pull us out of an economic depression. So the economic potential of a government investing in housing, whether it's doing it directly or indirectly, I think has a huge potential for the economies generally. And then the question, I guess, is of course that ownership versus rental, or what the hybrids are in between. But anyway, housing is both a massive problem and a remarkable potential for the economies of countries generally, and the wealth generation of individuals. I know in the States, I mean, the permanent underclass is a permanent underclass because it is constantly stuck in housing, for which it is spending more than 50% of its income, and will never get out. And it just perpetuates generation after generation, and it's extremely difficult to get out from under. So housing is really a problem and a potential solution to all of this stuff. Thank you all very, very much. I can't believe, again, how privileged I feel to be in and among you all. And I hope that Allan has done a great job in introducing us to each other, and I hope we're all going to stay in touch and continue this conversation. And Patricia, I look forward to meeting with you. And for me, the law of 1901 in the Netherlands is still the kind of benchmark of how housing policy should be done. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that. And we'll see you tomorrow for your keynote, which is great. And thank you all so much. It's an amazing privilege to be here with you all. So with that, we'll close this out. Allan?
Okay.
Take care, everybody. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.